Diamonds from Heaven. It was LSD in the Mind of the Universe. Was that the title?
Yes, that was the publisher's title, but my title while I was writing the book was always Diamonds from Heaven.
Okay, beautiful, absolutely. I've been a fan of your books. Actually, Colin and I talk about you regularly, about your books. I've been a fan. Reincarnation was wonderful, and then the one in the middle, and then the LSD book's been fabulous. So
thank you.
A lot of the people here do not know your research methods. So kind of what I would describe you as is an explorer of the outer reaches of the cosmos, really, kind of in search of the truth of reality and really what it means to be kind of human in this reality. And your research method is deeply interesting, and I would love if you could start us off by telling us about what that is and what your work has been.
Well, what we all share in the animistic community is the belief that nature is infused with consciousness, it's infused with mind and soul. And of course, now we know how vast the physical universe is, and the question becomes, how large is the mind of the universe? How deep is it? And so I was just out of graduate school in 1978, and I finished in philosophy of religion. And I met the work of Stanislav Grof, who many of you know, one of the foremost thinkers in the transpersonal psychology community and the psychedelic community. And I read his book, Realms of the Human Unconscious. And my life pivoted with that book because I immediately saw that his research was relevant not only to clinical psychology, but also to philosophy, that he was offering a method to actually safely and systematically explore the deepest levels of consciousness wherein lay the answers to the philosophical questions that I was carrying coming out of a training in religious studies. So in 1979, I began what became a 20-year journey working with LSD. And it was 1979. LSD is what Stan had done his research with, and it's what I chose to continue with. If I were doing it today, I would have a more diversified cocktail of ayahuasca, psilocybin more, but I worked with LSD, and I chose to work with very high doses for reasons that are too complicated to go into now. But that had a profound impact on the work because it not only changed how deep the work went, but it changed how wide it went. The field of consciousness that I took in these transformational exercises expanded with the power of the state of consciousness that I was entering to enter into these exercises. So basically, I did this work in standard Grofian protocol, totally isolated from the world with a sitter, a trained clinical psychologist sitter. I did it at home in a controlled environment, totally internally focused, not with any contact of the outside world, amplifying the states of awareness with carefully selected music designed to empower the states of consciousness, in which you basically just shatter your mind. In essentially working at these levels, you just shatter your mind, and your mind dissolves out into subtler and subtler forms or aspects of reality. And it became a systematic exploration of what I think of as the mind of the universe. I hesitate to call it the divine, though sometimes I do. It's just because the divine has so many culturally infused qualities in history that I'd rather avoid. So I think of it as the mind of the universe. And I did this work for 20 years. Always keeping very careful records and whatnot. And then I digested those experiences for another 20 years, because these are not immediately transparent experiences. They're very complex and interwoven, and they involve many levels of reality being orchestrated in the same kind of tidal surges of these states. And there was a systematic instruction. I found that one session more or less started where the other session stopped, when you work in this systematic fashion, there was a progressive deepening and deepening and deepening. And so it just took years for me to understand what the universe was showing me and where it was taking me. And I was being shown things. I mean, I always had a sense of a systematic encounter with an intelligence that was orchestrating my experience in dialogue with me, not taking any form, never taking any deity form or any archetypal form, but always, when pressed, dissolving into deeper and deeper layers of infinity. Anyway, so that is cumulatively the story that I'm telling in LSD and the Mind of the Universe.
And would you say, Chris, that this is an objective reality, that if anybody that did a similar method, I mean, I think what you did was incredibly brave, but would everybody kind of reach this unfolding that you did using that method, or is that not possible to say?
No, I think it is possible to say. I think Stan Grof's work allows us to say it, and where he's dealing with integrating the experiences of thousands of people, and I'm only talking integrating my experiences, but my experiences fit comfortably within the larger matrix that Grof's work has explored. And it's a complicated answer because on the one hand, I want to say yes, and on the other hand, I have to qualify that immediately, because when you begin this work, these substances only amplify consciousness. They don't give you an experience. They don't take you a particular place. They amplify your mind. And because each of us has a different life story, then the mind which is amplified is different. And we, therefore, when an amplified mind engages the deeper mind of the universe, what comes forward will be, in the beginning, somewhat unique and will reflect our individual history. And that's why these substances are very helpful for healing. They evoke our unconscious, and therefore they evoke our problems, and it's an individual experience. But if you keep going farther, if you press to the limits of your time-space identity, if you press to the limits of what your individual history can hold, and go through this transformation we call ego death, then you begin to open into spiritual reality farther removed from your own personal history. And that's when the experiences begin to overlap. That's when they begin to converge. Now, my understanding is that spiritual reality is not simply something you enter and pluck fruit from, like plucking an apple from a tree. It's interactive. It's always interactive. So there's a participatory quality to our experiences. So the mind that we bring to the encounter acts as a seed catalyst that crystallizes a certain set of experiences from the infinite potential of the mind of the universe. And then as we internalize those experiences and are purified by those experiences, it changes the seed mind. And then it catalyzes an even deeper level of secrets from the universe. So it's a both and situation.
Mm-hmm.
It's participatory, but once you understand the cycle of participation, then I think the universe that we discover is coherent and consistent. My universe is the same universe that is discovered by contemplative monks, the mystical traditions, the near-death episode traditions. There are degrees of depth, and then we have to be careful, because you can reach a point where you think, oh, this is what the reality is. And it turns out, well, no, this is what reality is at this level of reality, but you can pop that and go into a deeper level of reality, and things change a bit.
One thing that I find really exciting about your work is that we talk about practices, that finding the right practices to find the cracks kind of in ourselves to get back to a much more porous, expanded way of being. And yet these practices take repetition and tenaciousness and everything. And you have used a different method here. You've used what one might kind of think of as a fast track to some of these experiences. I mean, it's a very difficult method, and I'm sure not one that you would kind of recommend to a lot of people, but that feels for me where the excitement of your work is you've fast tracked a lot of slower practices and possibly got to the edge of the map that a lot of these contemplative practices have got to. I feel as though you've managed to go further than much that I've seen before on kind of what the underlying nature of reality is. Would you say that's true?
It is a fast track, except it's a fast track that doesn't allow any bypassing. So the fact that it's a fast track means it's a much more intensely concentrated track. So purification, which in a conventional spiritual path would be drawn out over years, can take place within days. And as any woman who's given birth knows, a short labor is not necessarily an easier labor. It's just much, much more intense. And this is true for this type of practice too. The purifications that one goes through in order to acclimate to these subtler and cleaner and clearer states of reality, those purifications and detoxifications are extremely intense. I mean, they send you in convulsions across the floor and throwing up constantly, coming and going. And they require a systematic purification of your lifestyle, just as any traditional spiritual practice does. And I want to emphasize that the states of consciousness that I touched for hours at a time, we usually only learn about these realities from the work of contemplative mystics who have a certain sense that they abide in these realities. And I emphasize that this is a practice not of abiding, it's a temporary access. It's only temporary immersion in these states. And I don't want to confuse temporary immersion from abiding immersion. All honor to the great ones who abide in these realities. You know, this is different. This is temporary access, very, very intense purification, but you don't come away with permanent access embedded in your nature to these realities. What you come away with are seeds of transcendence or seed experiences, which you then have to nurture within your daily spiritual practice. You have to nurture them within your embodied physical existence. And I also want to mention that these practices in the earlier times in history have tended to be associated with a dissociative spirituality. So the goal was to get up into transcendence and get away from Earth. You know, so these are the up and out cosmologies of the last 5 axial age religions of the last 5,000 years. The cosmology that emerged in my work is very different. It wasn't about getting transcendence. It was transcendence in service of incarnation, transcendence in service of deeper integration. It was about opening up and letting in as much of the universe as possible, and then going through the transformations that would allow this energy to live in the historical body, and giving me, at one point, insights into where the evolutionary intelligence was taking the human family as a whole. I began this work thinking in terms of a personal model of transformation, but things happened that just shattered that model. And I began to understand that I had been drawn into a collective transformation, and that my so-called individual work was part of a collective process, which then naturally yielded some insights into our collective family, human family evolutionary trajectory.
Fantastic. And I want to ask you about that in great depth in a minute, because for me, that's kind of the exciting thing that you discovered, if you like. But first of all, I'd love to ask you about the aliveness and intelligence in the universe then. we are talking about the aliveness and intelligence in everything around us, you know, and humans being just one node of that, but just kind of as is everything, an animate world, an animate universe. I just wondered if you could summarize your understandings of the aliveness in the universe, and how layered that is, and how deep that goes, how big it is. Yes, what have you gleaned?
Well, you're asking a lot, because you know, the universe is so vast, and the mind of the universe has so many layers to it. And those layers are, of course, all complexly interwoven, and it's all alive, and it's all intelligent. And it's everywhere we dig into the universe, of course, we discover aliveness and intelligence. We're finding that we can't dig in anywhere and not encounter this intelligence, this living intelligence. So when you dig into the mind of the universe, you find layers of intelligence operating there. There are layers of intelligence operating in the biosphere, operating in the incarnational rhythms of a planet. I began to experience at one point, for example, reincarnation. I had gone into, I'm sorry to cut so many corners here, but there's no way to do it except jump into it. Go into states of consciousness in which time was radically dilated, not eternity, not timelessness, but radical dilations of time and dilations of personal boundaries. So dissolving into my human family, becoming the human family. And from that perspective, experiencing reincarnation, the pulse of reincarnation taking place, all of us together as a single organism, incarnating generation by generation. And I experienced whole lifetimes incarnating in generations, living their lives, dying and returning into the spiritual reality. And there was an intelligence to this entire process, so that all of our, what I had previously thought of as individual karma, individual challenging, individual transformation, all of our individual karma was part of a vast network of exquisitely tuned collective karma. And history was expressing the rhythms of collective transformation through the medium of our individual transformation. Just one example, and then going deeper, beginning to experience the pulse of the entire universe as a single living organism. And when you dissolve into that level of oneness, you know, the Buddhists have a word for it. They talk about nirvana, blown out, self is blown out, or shunyata, emptiness of self. When you experience the world as one in any scale, then you experience that there are no permanent boundaries between yourself and the world. So literally, there is no private self. And so the self kind of pops and life runs through you. You run through life, and the whole of life breathes as one. It breathes together, as Plotinus said. So everywhere you touch it, the world is intelligent. At the very end of my journey, in the 70th session out of 73, I did 73 sessions. In the 70th session, I was taken deep, deep, deep into what I call deep time, farther into time than I had ever been taken before, and given a series of visions. And one of those visions had to do with experiencing, in some way, from my perspective and my history, the large story of what was happening in the universe. And I experienced reincarnation. I was experiencing the same deep pattern, and I experienced stars of light shooting out of time and space, shooting into the universe. And I understood that these were what I call diamond souls. These were the fruition of a reincarnation process, creating a diamond pure a soul that could explore the spiritual world in dimensions previously unavailable to it. time and space was creating diamond souls over vast periods of time. So layers and layers and layers of intelligence operating at different levels.
So when I read your book, Chris, I mean, it's literally mind-blowing. I mean, it's kind of, it feels as though it's science fiction, or it's in the realms of science fiction. And yet for me, there was nothing in there that didn't sound right. You know, it just kind of has that feeling of, yes, I understand this and it feels right to me. And I'd love to talk to you about the evolutionary process. You touched on it a bit there, but let's go into that in more detail. But first of all, reincarnation, because that is something that obviously we don't all feel is true, but you did earlier work on the subject of reincarnation. And just before we go on to the evolutionary story that you've seen, could you talk about a little bit about reincarnation and your work on it, and why you believe that that is what's happening?
Well, I did. I wrote my first book on reincarnation because I thought it was such an essential principle, because our philosophical roads divide if you think we only are on Earth one time or we're on Earth multiple times. Those lead to different visions of reality. And today, I think we have overwhelming empirical evidence that reincarnation is simply true. It's a fact of life. I think Ian Stevenson at the University of Virginia and his study of young children around the world who have spontaneous memories of their most immediate life, he's just documented hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these children. And his research has been challenged, but it's holding up. And I think he is the Charles Darwin of reincarnation studies. And then we have past life therapies, people coming in, highly qualified people, healing, using past life, access to past life memories to heal present life traumas. This, to me, is just an empirical fact of life. So after living, it takes a long time to sort of live in a reincarnation universe, to understand the implications of the fact that there's this pulse of life, and that all of us have been here multiple times, and all of us have deeper histories with place, with people, with projects, and that we're always starting something and we're continuing something in one lifetime, and we're doing something that's going to be continued in another lifetime, that this overlapping complexity, so that I don't see little children as little anymore, and I don't see old people as old anymore. Sometimes little children are deeply old in soul, and old people are sometimes very young in soul, and so it's you just tune to a different level. Now, I had that in the early stages of my psychedelic work. And in the early stages of my psychedelic work, I was taken into some of the nuts and bolts of reincarnation and karma. And then that became kind of ground one as I began to be taken into the human family, and to experience the human family evolving and growing through reincarnation. This, to me, reincarnation is simply the higher octave of evolution. It's the cutting edge of evolution in our particular species, where evolution was trying to change whole species. Reincarnation is evolving individuals within certain species. And I don't think just human species. I think somewhere lower down the line, reincarnation begins to turn and gestate. And then the question becomes, well, where is reincarnation taking us? If we are reincarnating so many times, where are we going? What's the whole project of it? What's the purpose of it? And to answer the question, what's the purpose of a reincarnating species, is complicated, because once you understand that every human being on the planet is reincarnating with a purpose, its specific purpose, then you realize the full breadth of the living experience of a human being, the breadth of what's being learned, that what humanity is learning is just enormous. And when we try to say, well, this is the purpose of life, we have a tendency to sort of take a purpose that we can identify with and maybe overgeneralize it to encompass all purposes. So we really have to look at the whole of the human family and gestate the whole of the things that people are learning to even begin to come up with some generality that encompasses them all. You see what I mean?
Mm.
So in some cases, we can be learning love, we can be learning generosity, we can be learning strength of self, we can be learning physical defense, we can be learning surrendering physical defense. What one person is growing into in one lifetime, another person may be growing out of, and both of them are living their truth. At a process level, most of the Eastern religions basically say, yes, you grow, you activate the chakras, you bring higher and higher levels of consciousness online. But when your consciousness opens up to divine essence, when it opens up to the you that is more real than any of your individual private incarnational yous, the divine you, the essential you, when you open up to that, then you reach enlightenment, what the Hindus call moksha, means you can escape. You can leave. So once you wake up, then let's get out of here. There's better places to be than Earth. So that's an up and out cosmology. But what happened in my sessions was different than that. I reached a point about halfway on my journey when all of my former lives began to come into me. I was in again, a kind of a pregnant time reality of deep time. And my former lives were coming in and it was like wrapping a filament of kite string around a spool. But that string was human experience. It was whole human lifetimes. And they kept coming together and they reached a critical mass. And when they reached a critical mass, they fused into one. And when that happened, there was a tremendous explosion of energy. And a diamond luminosity exploded from my chest. And that's when I began to understand and was shown that we make progress incrementally, lifetime by lifetime, as we incarnate. But the goal is not simply to make incremental progress. The goal eventually is that all of our lives come and fuse into one, and we become on Earth a being who has 100,000, hundreds of thousands of years of history in it, awakened within it, and empowered within it. That is the being that we are becoming. And that is a different kind of being than an egoic being. It's the vast depth of its heart is bigger. The breadth of its mind is bigger. The texture of its social relationships is bigger. And its relationship to nature is different because it knows that the world we leave is the world we inherit. It has a deeper embodied texture of its relationship with nature. And my discovery was that this is not simply a path of individuals. This is simply a story of individual spiritual awakening, that we are all going into this transition. We are all giving birth to the diamond soul. The entire species is at a point in its history where it can no longer afford the luxury of trying to live on this planet in the fragmented egoic state. When a world order is created by egos, it leads to a fragmented order that serves some and not others. But when the soul wakes up with the profound compassion of its history, the soul lives on this planet differently than the ego does. And I think we are coming into a very profound, tumultuous period of history, which I think of as a birth process. It will feel like a death process, and it is a death process. It's basically destroying the culture that was built by the ego and destroying the ego which built that culture. And in that process of dying to that which is small, giving birth to something new, giving birth literally to a new stage in the human story, not a new body politic and new economics and a shift I think, is taking place at the depths of the collective unconscious. The plate tectonics of the collective psyche are shifting in that Jungian sense, deep, deep down inside the human psyche. This transformation is taking place so that all human beings who are born after this transition will be living their individual life within the matrix of a different collective psyche. That, I think, is the work of the hour. That's what we are working to, and part of this to actualize. And part of this is reawakening to the divine presence, which we've stripped out of nature, tried to unsuccessfully, but reawakening to this common ground that we have with nature, to this intelligence that surrounds us and saturates us.
Wow, Chris, I mean, I'm imagining that people hearing this for the first time, it's kind of difficult to get your head around it. And I want to bring Colin in a minute. So to summarize in my kind of terms then, what you're talking about really is the evolution of the human species, individuals and collectively, towards a position where we can remember our entire history. So if we take reincarnation as a given, then we're evolving towards a place where we can remember past our past incarnations on this earth. And you know, Colin, can I bring you in here, because there's something that you talk about, you know, in reanimating ourselves, we need to have a completely new cognitive framework, you know, the way of connecting to the intelligence in the universe is so foreign to us now that we need a whole different framework to kind of be able to wrestle with that kind of information. What's your feeling about what Chris is talking about? I know you've read the book too, and I know you love it, so biased question here, but yeah, from your perspective.
Thanks, Rachel. Well, first of all, I really wanted to say how much of an honor it is to meet you, Chris. I have to say, you know, the encounter with your books, and the first one I encountered was Dark Night, Early Dawn, was really well, tectonic in nature for me. It was, and I'm filled with questions, and have been all the way through reading your books and rereading them and reading them again and thinking about it and brewing on it. And a lot of the questions I really want to ask, I have no idea how I would even articulate. I can feel them and I can sense them, but how? And so I mean, I can feel myself at the sort of edges, you know, of my, what I call my present cognition, because, you know, I was lucky enough to be born into and brought up within a traditional indigenous culture here in Southern Africa, and through my childhood lived in wilderness and among people who had a very, very particular relationship with wilderness and a cosmology that came out of that. Yeah. And subsequently, I find myself, you know, in the worlds of post-industrial world, trying to reconcile that part of me with the part of me I find myself in now, and finding that it's very difficult to bring it. It feels like, in a certain sense, that there are two cognitive frameworks within me at some level, and that somehow I'm tasked with trying to reconcile these two parts of myself. And reading through your books, where I found myself pulled back into the cognitive system, really, that I grew up in, and that forms a kind of an understructure within my experience now. But I mean, within that, then I have questions. I mean, loads of them, which your books really brought up in me, and among the most difficult to articulate are questions around time, and the notion that somehow or other, you know, so reincarnation is not something that really comes into the cosmologies here in Southern Africa, and yet it does. It's implicit in certain terms. but I'm really, so as we look at this idea of reincarnation, and the cognitive framework that I would perceive it from here as we speak about it relies on a sequence of time that speaks of a past from which we come and a future to which we go. But what happens if we take that out? If in fact that's merely my present cognitive framework? But how would we understand reincarnation and the notion of a trajectory towards something if time in its kind of sequence from beginning to seeming culmination or some such thing, if that wasn't the case?
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm making any sense in what I'm saying.
Making sense. It's a good question. If we eliminate the arrow of time, then reincarnation begins to look like multi-incarnation, not reincarnation. Some people have conceptualized this: we're living all of our lives simultaneously and that we're interacting. All these lives are active and interacting in a way that befuddles the logic of linear development. And it requires a different kind of logic. And I've tried to think in that world multiple times, and I basically keep coming down to, I can't do it. I mean, I literally cannot live in a world where multi-incarnation makes sense. I can't make it make sense. Now, another little thread, Robert Monroe from the Monroe Institute of Applied Science, out-of-body guy, wrote 3 wonderful books on the out-of-body state, Exploring the Universe Daily from the Out-of-Body State. He says, you reach a point in your spiritual development where you discover that you can incarnate in any time period you wish. So soul forward does not mean time forward. Right? So you can incarnate in the 10th century BC, and next you could incarnate in the 20th century AD. So permeability of time, do you see how that continues the concept of linear development, but it flexes on the concept of time's absolute linearity? For myself, I've gone through so many permutations of time, moving into deep time, where you can, I experienced my entire life in the early stages, birth to death, simultaneously present. Absolutely, I was experiencing the whole of my life, the end and the beginning and all of its development as a simultaneous whole. Later, I was taken into periods of time where 100,000 years were being lived out as if it were 1 minute. It's convinced me that the universe has many modalities of time built into it, that when we move into deeper dimensionals of reality, there are different modalities of time that are available there. All that you would think, and it does make me receptive to the idea of letting go of a concept of linear time and linear development. And somehow I try to reconcile the fact that from the universe's perspective, there are multiple modalities of time, so that the universe can show me the future from its time, and can give me the experience of knowing the future as something which has already happened, and simultaneously which is yet to happen. And at the same time, hold on to some notion of the value and the challenge of something approximating linear development. And I think my best take is that life chops its challenges to us, it chops the learning into bits and pieces. And we can't learn it all in one lifetime. We can't do it all simultaneously. It's easier if it's just broken down into bits and pieces. And if this challenge of linear development is coming to a fruition and is coming to a diamond soul, an awareness that holds all of its time moments in its present consciousness on Earth, this, of course, is not the end of the developmental story, of the linear story, because in 1,000,000 years, we'll be farther. In 1 billion years, we'll be farther still. the universe is just getting warmed up. You know, is that we have no reason for thinking that the universe is anywhere near the end of its evolutionary story. We know it's really at the early stages of its story. So I think of time as one of the great gifts of evolution. The individuality is one of the great gifts of the physical universe. Time is one of the gifts of the physical universe. Behind that lies permutations of metaphysics that are more fluid with respect to time. But inside space-time, I think there is an approximate linear arrow of time which serves the soul's purpose, which serves some deeper cosmic web. And yet at the same time, when we are in the linear development, if we open up to the universe, if we open up to the universe's sense of time, we often get these flashes of more than the present, you know, more parallel dimensions of time. So your question makes a lot of sense, and it's a substantive question.
Can I ask one, Colin, or do you want to come back on that? Okay, so
yeah, great.
This is the problem with your work, Chris. We need to keep trying to. We're out in kind of like inarticulable terrain, aren't we? When we get to that, what you call the diamond soul, then when there's this moment of remembering. What are the other attributes? What are the other kind of, what does that bring other than remembering and wholeness? You know, did you have an experience of what else?
Well, first of all, I think soul consciousness is what we return to when we die. So while we're in the Bardo Earth kind of stage, when we die, we return to whole consciousness. So it's not something we're unfamiliar with. It's something we are familiar with. And then we precipitate out of whole consciousness into part consciousness, egoic consciousness, and we return. So it's a constant accordion kind of effect. We die as we get large. We're born, we get small. We die, we get large. We're born, we get small. Sooner or later, if we just keep up for a few thousand years, 100 million years, sooner or later, large wakes up inside physical consciousness. And so it's simply a consolidation of what's taking place naturally and normally. It's just a stage in this process. The times that I've been carried into deep time and experienced temporarily my diamond soul, and then the diamond soul, the soul that's emerging as an archetypal imprint, an archetypal form. It's hard to describe because of the enormity and the beauty and the joy. We're talking about a human being that's completely healed of all the wounds of history, that's healed of all the terrible things we've done to each other, men and women and wars and violence. It's healed, all of those scars healed. A tremendous breath of communion with the natural world, an intimacy with all life forms. Not only then a breath of companionship with all life and with other human beings and with human community and with nature's community, but an openness of the mind, able to take in more directly, enter into deeper communion with the intelligence of the universe. I mean, the genius of the universe has all the answers to all the technological questions we want to have answers to. And we just are not able to download all that knowledge. And the diamond soul is a more complete and higher potency of human being that can enter into deeper downloads from the divine intelligence. But it's not only an expansion of heart and an expansion of mind. Our physical senses are also amplified by orders of magnitude. In the very, very last session, after 73 sessions, the very last session, the universe gave me an experience of what I call diamond vision. Suddenly, in a kind of a late session, wind down, clear space, my vision became thousands of times more acute and sharper than it had ever been before. I could see things, details, gradients of color, sharpness and precision of form. I could just see. I was amazed that I ever had accepted this fuzzy stuff as real seeing. This was diamond clarity seeing. And then after 10 minutes, it went away and I was seeing the way I normally see. And that's when I realized what I was being shown is that we tend to think of sensation as kind of a biomechanical process, but it's actually a conscious process. And the more consciousness which is present in this body has built into it the capacity for infinitely higher levels of sensate experience, touch, hearing, seeing, sensitivities of all manner of physical sensations. So it truly is, it's heaven on earth in the body, so that the body participates in the qualities of heaven without having to leave the physical existence. This is why I mean it's not an up and out cosmology. It's bringing it in deeper and deeper and deeper, changing literally the physiology of the body to allow it to operate in this ecstatic state, which becomes the normal state. Yeah, that is a child I think is worth the labor that we're going into to give birth to. And we are going in a terribly, terribly severe labor. Our past is being stripped away, will be stripped away. We will lose all capacities that we associate with normal and minimal existence. This is what happens in all mystical traditions, in all psychedelic traditions. Literally, the small has to be broken, ground to dust, stripped and dismembered in order for the new to awaken within us. And this is happening now historically, where we're entering into what I think of as the dark night of our collective soul. The dark night is an image often used for a hard time, but it's not a hard time. In John of the Cross, the dark night of self is a hard time. The dark night of the soul is a very, very intense purification time, which immediately precedes the awakening of full illumination. And a dark night of the collective soul is a time of intense purification, intense loss of reality as we have known it up to this point in time. And I think out of the pain and suffering that's coming, it's going to crack us open and break us down to our center. And in this ordeal, we will not survive, but we will give birth to that in us, which is more beautiful, more ecstatic, more competent, more plugged in. I think we truly are becoming a species of Buddhas, a species of Christs and prophets. These are the models we've had, trying to give us some forevision of what's happening. In the early years, we could not imagine an ordinary human being reaching that level of excellence. But now we're beginning to understand through reincarnation over and over and over and over again, slowly, we grow into that level of excellence, which is simply a level of transparency to the essential condition in which we experience life the irony is we experience what's always been happening all the way along. It's always been this way. The universe has always been one. The universe has always been filled with intelligence. We have always been empty of self, but somehow we've distracted ourselves for thinking that that's not there. It's always been there. So we're waking up to the paradise that the universe already is. We've just been missing it.
Wow, Chris, I just find your experience and your vision just such a hopeful one as we move into what we see as ecological crisis and societal crisis. And I just, again, as I felt quite emotional and said at the beginning, it was just one of the most inspiring books, or the most inspiring book last year, but one of the most of my lifetime, you know, and I'm sure Colin would agree with me on that. So it's so wonderful to hear.